All right, welcome back after lunch, and welcome to a marathon session. We are going to run through the afternoon from now until 3:45. There will not be breaks in between the sessions, but that is so that we can start our drinks bang on schedule at 3:45. So if you need to go to the restroom or leave for a moment to do so, but really focus on the fact that we're aiming for drinks as early as physically possible. I am Richard Gowan. I am the UN Director for the International Crisis Group. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and Crisis Group is very privileged to be one of the associate partners for this event. It's also always a little daunting to be doing the panel after lunch on the second day of a conference, especially when the topic is UN reform, which are not necessarily words that bring joy. But I think we have an excellent panel, and this is also an incredibly important topic, because Kofi Annan was probably the greatest reformer of the UN system. And if you look back to his time, he achieved an enormous amount on reform on at least 3 different levels. He reformed the management and the secretariat early in his first term. He changed the way that the organization did peacekeeping out in the field, working, of course, with Lakhdar Brahimi, and you discussed that yesterday. And perhaps most remarkably, he initiated reforms to the intergovernmental architecture of the UN, with the creation of the Peace-Building Commission, the creation of the Human Rights Council. He didn't achieve his holy grail, of course, which was Security Council reform. But nonetheless, he did manage to deliver a remarkable number of changes to the UN at all 3 levels. Today, we still very much live in the UN that Kofi built, but it is changing, and we are in the middle of a period of very significant reforms launched by Secretary General Guterres, and Michelle Griffin will talk more about those. And next year, we're approaching the 75th anniversary of the UN, and there are many people in New York who believe that this should be a moment for even greater changes to the organization, similar to the World Summit in 2005, where Kofi was able to deliver reforms such as the creation of the Peace-Building Commission in a major package of change. So today we're going to look back, we're going to look at Kofi as a reformer, and we're going to look forward, and we're going to ask what changes are necessary for the UN now, and what is achievable in a very difficult political climate, frankly, in New York over the next 18 months or so. To do that, we have an outstanding panel. Lord Hannay of Chiswick, a former UK ambassador to the UN, who was also a member of the high-level panel that set the stage for the 2005 World Summit. Michelle Griffin, who has been doing UN reform longer than is strictly healthy, but has been working first under Kofi, then under Ban Ki-moon, and now with Guterres on policy issues. Patricia Lewis from Chatham House, but formerly with UNIDIR in Geneva, and we'll be talking a lot, I think, about disarmament reforms, which are a crucial part of the current agenda. And Danny Sriskandarajah from Oxfam, who has not had a UN career, excluding 3 months as an intern in 1999, as I've just discovered, but is currently the chief executive of Oxfam, and will bring that perspective to these discussions. To kick off, I'm going to ask each of the panelists what they think Kofi Annan's greatest reform legacy was, and what they think the most urgent reform priority for the organization is now. And then we'll go into fuller discussion. David, you first.
Right, thank you, Richard. Well, firstly, the credit for the reforms that were achieved in 2005 was Kofi's. Let's have no doubt about that at all. He was the first and so far the only Secretary General of the United Nations who was ever called for a comprehensive overhaul of its structure and its institutions. and he deserves, in my view, a huge amount of credit for it, all the more so because he did so, the fork in the road, as it were, as he called it, he did so at a very unpropitious moment after the breakdown of Security Council solidarity over the invasion of Iraq. And he was not daunted by that. So he deserves, in my view, a lot of credit for prescience and a lot of credit for courage from that. And he is not always given that, partly because the word reform at the United Nations, as I discovered when I complained plaintively about the name that had been given to this panel, high-level panel on threats, challenges and change, which I suggested unkindly was a little clunky. I was told, yes, but you're not allowed to mention the word reform, because the word reform at the UN just means reforming the Security Council and nothing else. And of course, Kofi didn't want to just reform the Security Council. He wanted an overall approach, of which that was one part. I thought he also deserves a lot of credit because he devised a method which had a better chance of surviving to a decision point than if he'd thrown it straight into the 190 plus ambassadors, who I may say were extremely fed up that they had not been told from the outset that they should reform this great organization. And so I spent most of my life having pins stuck into me by various ambassadors, including Sergei Lavrov, who didn't think that Yevgeny Primakov was by any means the right person to put in charge of that. It should have been him. But Kofi chose a method which was to bring together a group of people whom he knew, all of them, from experience, a wide amount of experience in different UN positions, and whom he felt sure would put their backs into it and would also not allow national interest to simply turn this into a revamped Security Council. And he was right. And he also gave himself the space to put himself, insert himself in his paper In Larger Freedom before the 192 ambassadors with their liberal quantities of reducing fluids was able to start to work on them. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. What were the successes? Well, I would list a few, which were obviously the responsibility to protect, clearly also the Peacebuilding Commission, clearly the Human Rights Council. Not often noticed that we said 4 years before anything was done about it that it really was time for the G20 to meet at summit level and to bring to bear the 80% plus of the world's economies to try and address some of the main economic issues. And that was in our report too. We also, something that was touched on in one of yesterday's panels, did put a lot of emphasis on the need for the UN to work more closely with regional organizations on peacekeeping and peacemaking. And there was quite a lot of material in our report about how to take that forward, almost all of which has been, in fact, implemented and more, as we heard from Comfort Aero. Now, that was successes as I would call them, but of course none of them was a total success. That really would be asking for something that the UN does not deliver. So R2P, being somewhat discredited by the way in which the Libya worked out, correctly discredited in the sense that the follow-up was totally deficient. But does that prove that responsibility to protect has no future? I do not believe that is the case at all. Are we really saying that we need another couple of genocides before we get back on the job again? Well, I'm not saying that anyway. And there are places all over Africa now in which there are missions being carried out by the UN, very, very difficult circumstances, Central African Republic, DRC, South Sudan, etc., where they are providing some protection, inadequate, but it's there. And we've got to get better at understanding that R2P is not just about military intervention. It's about the whole toolbox. And then the Peacebuilding Commission, under-resourced, underused, and it still is. and it needs to be given more jobs and more resources and more backup by the UN. Of course, many of the UN's agencies don't like it very much because it's not them and it's not under their control. But I still think that in these rather large number of countries which are making very slow transition from hostilities, strife, possibly a terrible amount of killing and so on, to normal place where they can actually have a development policy, and that is not a short transition. You need somebody who pulls all the threads together. So I think that's true. The G20 I mentioned already, the Human Rights Council is an improvement in my view on the old Commission. The Universal Periodic Review is a big step forward, but the hard fact is that without enforcement powers, as the UN has always been without enforcement powers on human rights, you don't get terribly far, and we have not cracked that problem. So what do we lose? What ended up on the cutting room floor? Quite a lot. Of course, the two possible models for reforming the Security Council, and fortunately, and thanks largely to Kofi's own personal efforts, the failure of that did not carry the whole reform package to the bottom of the sea, which is what a lot of people would have liked to have seen happen, but it didn't. They were decoupled. We also lost something which I greatly regret, which was the guidelines for the Security Council when authorizing the use of force, the usual Augustinian principles, which we believed ought to have been written into a Security Council resolution as a kind of yardstick. That disappeared. And of course, John Bolton's greatest triumph, he removed the whole of the chapter on proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. An extraordinary success in the light of what has subsequently happened. But he, I'm sure, will wish to take credit for it, and he deserves it. But it was a terrible thing to have done. We also failed my favorite tiny little addition, which was to remove the enemy state provisions from the Charter. But unfortunately, there was no way in which anyone was going to agree to Charter reform if there wasn't a reform of the Security Council, so that went down too. And for the future, well, I personally do not think that the moment is right or the conditions very propitious for another comprehensive overall reform approach. I think a sectoral approach is much more likely to succeed. And of the sectors I would identify, obviously there is the Secretary General Guterres's conflict prevention and all that, which is under consideration now. There is the upcoming summit on climate change. And I would argue there ought to be something really serious on nuclear proliferation treaty and disarmament don't forget that next May, when the review conference, the 5-year review conference takes place, it is the 50th anniversary of the signature of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that subject has been simply ignored since the end of the Cold War, and nobody seems to have noticed that it's come back with a bang, luckily not a real bang yet, a bang in the last 4 or 5 years. So I would say those three sectors are very high priorities, but I wouldn't myself suggest that it would be sensible to launch an overall approach. And I'd only add that, in fact, when the 50th anniversary of the UN took place in 1995, an effort was made, a premature effort was made to do something then, and it ended up with about 100 pages of hot air. So I wouldn't myself think that just because it's the 75th anniversary, that will miraculously produce outcomes. It won't necessarily do so. And as I say, I don't think the time is very propitious.
So, Michelle, John Bolton is back. You're still doing reform. What are we going to do about it?
You don't want me to answer the question about biggest difference in the future?
No, okay, yes. Actually, start with the legacy.
Okay, well, I will only because actually it sets the scene for what I was going to say anyway. well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. It's an absolute joy to see so many old friends with whom I have worked in the trenches on reform and who were champions of reform at various points in my decades at the UN. Thanks also to Kofi's family for sharing him with us, both during the years when it was a privilege to work with him, but now also his memory. It's definitely been a very nostalgic couple of days. In terms of the kind of biggest difference question, I think the thing that Kofi got in a way that maybe no other Secretary General has is that reform wasn't necessarily about structures and moving boxes around, but really it was about kind of the collective commitment of member states and the trust of member states in the institution of the UN and in kind of pooling their resources and bringing them to bear on global problem solving. And that also to me is the thing that we most urgently need today to restore. And so what that looked like in '97 when we had a US financial crisis and loss of US trust in the UN and a peacekeeping crisis, he undertook reforms that looked at kind of management and peacekeeping. What that looked like in 2003 at the fork in the road time was a big overhaul of the architecture and an attempt to kind of regain the compact that underpins collective security, first and foremost in the Security Council, but not only in the Security Council. And I agree with Lord Haney's points about the kind of pros and cons of what came out of that reform. One reform that we don't talk about much is his 2006 effort on his way out the door, which Mark will remember well, where, to try to kind of overhaul the management in a way to really give the Secretary General the kind of steering capacity needed to run this massive sprawling organization. And I mean, obviously at that point he was deeply wounded by the oil for food exercise that had been undertaken, and I won't use the words I'd like to about that, but it had exposed weaknesses in the SG's management kind of set up, and he was trying to address those. And there was also a report on trying to consolidate the UN at country level, which in fact Antonio Guterres has now kind of picked up. But structures aside, I think the big contribution he made to reform were the ideas, and those have come out very clearly in the last couple of days, and they were really at the heart of what he tried to do, putting human beings at the center of the collective security endeavor. Opening up the UN to civil society and using the power of public opinion to achieve global agendas, inviting civil society into the decision-making space in a way that had never been done before, inviting the private sector in via the Global Compact. I mean, he paid a price every time for trying to do these things, but I think we today benefit massively from the doors that he opened. I think he was the first SG to really understand the linkages between development, peace, security, and human rights, and Mary Robinson yesterday mentioned the fact that he mainstreamed human rights across the work of the organization through all of his decision-making bodies. Again, a legacy that we benefit from today, but a fight that is not yet won for sure. And as mentioned earlier this morning, the kind of whole idea of kind of identifying goals to kind of drive global development and cohere people around these kinds of big targets and goals, and building coalitions to that end, and coalitions that didn't just include member states. So to me, the big legacy from his era is all of those ideas that actually completely still drive the reform agenda to this day, against, I think, was it Amina who said, much greater headwinds than we faced.
And what do we do in the face of those headwinds now? What are your main priorities?
I mean, okay, so I think first and foremost, back to basics, we do really need to kind of find a sense of a global order that can solve big problems, that people believe in and have faith in. And I mean, we're obviously living in an era where there's been a popular loss of trust in institutions of government. I mean, I think the one thing, I think it's a very different time, obviously, and in some respects, 2006, when Ban Ki-moon took office, was a real inflection point. And Kofi, for all of the personal, amazing qualities he brought to bear on the job, he did also enjoy, as I think we've said a couple of times, a fairly golden moment in the kind of history of multilateralism. And 2006, we had obviously the kind of aftermath of the Iraq War, and the kind of loss of trust that engendered at the heart of the UN in the Security Council, the Libya intervention, I think, contributed to that loss of trust. We had the global financial crisis, which caused, I think, a massive popular loss of trust in institutions and in truth-telling and in the ability of leaders to solve people's problems. We also had iPhone and Twitter and Apple and all the whole kind of the kind of life-altering digital age kind of come upon us, and Ban Ki-moon was personally the first Secretary General who had to kind of cope with that. So we're in a very different geopolitical moment, but that fundamental challenge still remains. How do you convince people that we have a global order that can solve their problems and that it's a system that works for the many and not just for the few? So again, that's not a structural change. It's about the idea of collective action. More specifically, I think looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, how do we adapt to a world where middle-income countries need very different things from the UN than developing countries used to need? And how do we adapt to a world where the kind of fragile countries that are conflict-affected continue to need some of the very traditional tools and interventions that we can provide, but in much more complex, high-risk settings? I think we need to get serious about crisis prevention, conflict prevention, and that's something that I spend a lot of my time on, and that this Secretary General is very committed to. And restoring trust also at the heart of the UN itself, between member states and the Secretariat, between the UN and civil society, and also between this generation and succeeding generations. And I think that's another thing that Kofi saw coming, but maybe didn't have to grapple with in the way this Secretary General does, which is the cross-generational equity considerations at the heart of the climate debate. And how do we do justice to the future in our current negotiations, for instance, on climate? Thank you.
Danny, how does it look from your perspective?
Well, you mentioned my brief but glorious 3-month internship at the UNDP. Mark had just started. It wasn't successful or memorable for its reform impacts, and it's not a subject that I know a lot about. But one memory, and the first time I ever saw Kofi Annan from a distance, was almost 20 years ago, July 1999. There was a concert inside the UN General Assembly. Wycliffe Jean was there, Bono was there, Ted Turner was there. It was effectively the marking, I mean, Ted had promised the $1 billion a bit earlier, but it was effectively one of the key moments in the life of the UN Foundation. And not only was there the sort of rock star glamour brought to the UN in a way that I think very few other SGs I can imagine being able to do as well as Kofi did, but it underlines this point that Michelle made, that I think, to me, this was a Secretary General who got how important it was to relate to people outside the system. And this, somewhat ironic given that he came from within the system in many ways, but recognized and invested in the need to do that. And the last time I saw him, along with many of us here, was last July in Johannesburg at the Elders event. And even then, I think he saw and continued to invest in that importance of partnership, of pulling, being truly multi-stakeholder, I suppose, in our ability to deliver some of these important values and gains. And for me, one of the hallmarks of that era were not just concerts like that one, no matter how enjoyable they were, but it was the advent of the Global Compact. It was the Cardoso Commission looking at UN civil society relationships. And I would argue that we are far, far from perfect when it comes to the engagement of non-state actors into these processes, but we're in a much better place. And I think that's, to me, a key area where we need to continue to invest in a time when, it seems a bit crazy and counterintuitive to think that just as a time when multilateralism is under such attack, we need to sort of pivot to a much more multi-stakeholder process to protect what's valuable and important about multilateralism. But I think that is where we are. And I'm seeing it. I've been asked to be a member of a UN high-level panel on digital cooperation, co-chaired by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates. And we have our report coming out next Monday. And in this process, what's becoming clear is if you take the question of digital governance, an incredibly important part of all of our lives now, and increasingly so in the future, the current systems, the current infrastructure, the current approaches that we have to promote cooperation in the digital sphere are woefully inadequate and in some cases deeply problematic. The pace of digital transformation, the very interdependent nature of all of our lives means that no one person, no one company, no one member state can really do very much, and nor should they be allowed to do very much in terms of shaping how the governance and control of that digital space looks. And I think that would be my example of taking this legacy of that approach of that commitment to multi-stakeholderism and transplanting it into what I believe is one of the important opportunities. I mean, it is a challenge, but such a huge opportunity. And global governance in the digital era in 20 or 30 years is going to necessarily look incredibly different from what it looks like now. And we need to start planning for that, building on that legacy that I believe was begun in Kofi Annan's time.
Thank you. I should say that Bono still comes to the UN quite a lot. We can hardly get rid of him. Every day is a beautiful day, frankly, in the UN. Patricia, David mentioned the nuclear file. I think it's also worth remembering that the high-level panel in 2004, 2005 focused on other issues like biosecurity and actually said things about biosecurity that were well ahead of their time. And I believe that Kofi was pushing on those issues, but they got lost in the years that followed. So it would be fascinating to see what you think his legacy on disarmament is and how we deal with the increasingly terrifying disarmament picture today.
So first of all, the positive part was that I think that, as Michelle rightly pointed out, and David and Danny, was this human security element, and what became known in the UN as security first in the development world, and building on Boutros Boutros-Ghali's approach to disarmament and conflict resolution. We began this whole process on small arms and light weapons control, on landmines, which was a difficult thing for the Secretary General for Kofi Annan because it didn't put the UN at the heart. It was a like-minded process that went on outside the UN, and that challenged the Under-Secretary General, Jayantha Dhanapala, greatly. But Kofi Annan rose to it, and the UN became the depository despite that, and despite, I have to say, some of the people advising him around. And I thought that was a real step up for the UN to start to take, if you like, that role within a like-minded process. And I think it's one that's being revisited over and over again. So we had the small arms, we had before that the mine ban, we had the cluster munitions, and then of course all this led to the arms trade treaty later. So you can see the legacy and the arc which was put in place then. My first meeting with Kofi Annan actually was just after I arrived as director of UNIDIR, and we were launching a book by Robin Poulton and Ibrahim Mag-Yousef, who many people will know here, on the Peace of Timbuktu, which was an extraordinary event in Timbuktu in which weapons, small arms and light weapons were collected from all over Mali and put into a big bonfire in Timbuktu. It was remarkable because Henny van der Graaf, this Dutch general who was like in charge of operations, went and he said, "We have removed every single bullet from these, and to prove it, I will take one at random." And he pulled out the gun, and of course, he hadn't removed the bullet from that one. And it was an amazing time. And UNDP was involved, UNIDIR was involved. What became then the Department for Disarmament Affairs was involved, and that was the other thing he did. He put the department back. He put Jayantha Dhanapala as the Under-Secretary General back in charge of disarmament, which had been downgraded before into an office under DPA. So that was a really big thing, and I think it fed into the whole Peace-Building Commission, into the whole approach to human security that is still at the core, that's now feeding into the conflict prevention approach. And then of course came the awfulness of 9/11. There came the awfulness of what happened with the Iraq War. And I think where the UN just didn't manage to grab the narrative was in trusting its inspectors, trusting in UNMAVIC, which was the follow-on from UNSCOM, with Hans Blix and Mohammed Al-Baradei, building on the work of Rolf Ekéus, and everyone involved, and there were a lot of people involved in that, from UNIDIR, from DDA, from DPA, and so on. Everybody was trying to understand what was going on, trying to help Hans, trying to help Mohammed. And what what everyone understood was that we didn't really know what had happened to the bioweapons. That was clear from all the research that had been done. We were very clear on the nuclear issue, that there were no nuclear weapons, that there was no longer a genuine nuclear weapons program. There might have been a twinkle in the eye of a dying nuclear engineer somewhere, but it was not a program. And then we were fairly certain about the chemical weapons, that there were a few left, but they were very old, and we were worried more about the safety aspects of them than we were the security issues. And then the UN inspectors, I don't know if everyone remembers this, but the UN inspectors went into the field to do these inspections, couldn't find anything except they found a whole load of longer range missiles that shouldn't have been built. None of the US and UK intelligence were bringing that one forward. So that immediately said to you that the caliber of the UN inspectors was phenomenal. And we're finding the UN intelligence actually was better probably than all the rest. But somehow the narrative in the Security Council was not the UN narrative. And I think that brings me in to what I think going forward we need to do in terms of an emphasis. I think we're back again with dear Mr. Bolton et al. And we're again losing the narrative about the role of the UN, the importance of the UN. Not to everyone who already knows that, not to all the young people who really get it, but to the people who, when you meet them, they go, oh, the UN, it's corrupt. Oh, the UN, oh, it doesn't do anything. Oh, it's a big bureaucracy. It's those people we've just never been able to sort of take charge of that and really change that. And you're right, it's all about the way we're viewing institutions generally. It's part of a bigger picture, and it goes back, I think, in recent memory anyway, to the post-9/11 Bush era. I do have a bugbear. You asked us about bugbears, which you haven't. So my bugbear was the mandate review.
I was going to come to bugbears at the end.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'd like to put in a marker for a Bolton-esque mandate review, which was a terrible waste of money, and I would love to see an audit done of it and charge it to him personally.
Right at the end of the session, we're going to come back to what reforms everyone hates. Before we open it up, a few individual questions. David, a very parochial question, but do you think the UK can still be a leader on UN reform? If you go back to the Kofi era, the Brits were always amongst his strongest allies, I think, on many strands of reform. Today we have an outstanding ambassador in New York, Karen Pierce, actually a very strong team in New York, if they're watching the live stream. But clearly we have certain local difficulties. Do you think the UK can still be a political driver of change at the UN?
Well, not on its own, no. But that never has been the case. And you do have to ask the question, the UK can try to lead, but will anyone follow? Clearly, the UK's influence in international affairs has been deeply and negatively affected by the decision in the referendum to leave the European Union, which knocked away the twin pillars of British foreign policy over the last 70 years, which was our influence in Washington, which was partly due to our influence in Brussels. Neither of those two operate for quite different reasons in the same way as they did, and will not do so if we do eventually leave the European Union. If we don't leave, then I think we could find ourselves bouncing back, as we did in the 1980s, after the 1970s, when we lost a very great deal of international influence, not to the same position as before, but certainly the rebuilding of that influence in Washington and Brussels would be possible, as it will not be if we are outside the European Union. There is still one area in which we undoubtedly do lead, and that is on official development aid, the 0.7%. That is, of course, under attack. There are, I think, before the Conservative leadership election is out, you will see some of the candidates will be saying that they're going to remove that or try to remove it. They might find it a bit difficult since it's in statute now, and I don't quite see where the majority in the House of Lords is going to come to repeal that statute, but still, they might try. But that is now not the sole, but the main pillar of support for Britain at the United Nations. And if you take that away, then I'm afraid there won't be much leadership.
Michelle, it's a bit unfair to ask you on the record about member states.
Yes,
You're
going to do it.
No, I mean, I think in the past, reform was often seen as being driven largely by Western states. And clearly, the environment for reform has changed. The balance of power in the UN is shifting away from some of the old Western drivers of change. Do you think that it's possible to get the Indias, the Brazils, maybe not Brazil at the moment, but the rising middle-income countries to really lead on reform? Or do you think that they're always going to be instinctively conservative?
So first of all, you're right, but that's not the whole story. I do think reform was often perceived to be driven in particular by not just Western powers, but by the big funders for whom reform was synonymous with cutting the budget, cutting posts, efficiencies. And so there was always a counter pressure from the G77, broadly speaking, who resisted that version of reform and of course wanted to protect the resources that would flow towards development work and not see those resources being diverted, for instance, to the more political and prevention work, which they perceived as being more Western driven. Those dynamics remain, but I do think that along with the kind of overall geopolitical fluidity and the kind of greater array of actors around the table, not just member states but others, we are seeing different kind of pockets of both resistance to and championing of reform. However, reform still does mean different things to those different constituencies. So it is a big challenge for us now to try to understand what these kinds of middle-income emerging powers want from the UN in the future and what reforms it will take to get us there. I think that the blessing and the curse for the current Secretary General is that he came into office with a very clear mandate and a very clear set of kind of instructions from member states about what they wanted. And they don't necessarily agree with each other, of course, so it's also a very loose and unprioritized set of instructions. But, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Agreement, there were the Hippo report. I mean, there were a pre-existing set of kind of instructions that he received. So he had a very strong mandate to adapt the UN to those wishes, clearly stated wishes of member states. And I think it was said a couple of times yesterday that member states feel more ownership of and are more assertive vis-a-vis these agreements and reform than they were in the 90s. But also possibly less ambitious. We don't see legal agreements anymore. We mostly see kind of non-binding political declarations, and then we see all the kind of walking back and forth and dancing around whether people are going to actually meet their kind of political commitments. So figuring out with that kind of very ambitious but very unprioritized agenda, what it is the UN can deliver for these different groups of member states, what they want from us. That really has been, I think, the kind of essence of Antonio Guterres' first couple of years in office. And again, I think, at broad brush, people generally agree, for instance, with his priority on preventing crisis. He does talk a lot about crisis prevention as opposed to purely conflict prevention, because I think after 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees, he saw firsthand the extent to which the kind of origins of crisis are actually very interlinked and very much kind of the same essential original root causes of exclusion and discrimination and now a lot of climate-related causes as well, and whether a country takes a kind of a trajectory towards political crisis or conflict or high levels of drought and displacement, I mean, if you're tackling crisis at its root, you're not just making those distinctions yet. So he very much thinks in terms of crisis prevention broadly, and of course member states very much sign up to that, but the devil is, as usual, in the UN in the details of what does that mean in practice, and where do resources get put, and in an environment of shrinking resources overall for the UN specifically and for multilateralism more broadly, you do have to prioritize. So the perennial challenges are exactly the ones that Kofi would have recognized, but the details are slightly different.
Danny, turning to you with a version of the same question. Do you think that it's possible to get a really global civil society focus on UN reform? or is it something which resonates in certain countries more than others? There's a huge amount of concern in the UN system today that the organization feels almost completely irrelevant to Asia, for example, and how to connect with Asian publics is a huge challenge for the UN. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that sort of framing.
I think there's a difficult set of questions that we need to address very urgently around, what do we mean by citizen participation in multilateral systems? I think the model, despite all of the progress I described earlier, I think is not fit for purpose, and certainly not fit for 21st century purpose in terms of citizen engagement. And I think we have a double democratic deficit, if you may, that's evolving. At the national level, based on 6 years' experience of working at Civicus, the global civil society platform, the evidence is deeply worrying. We're backsliding on, just at a time when the tools and technology should allow for us as citizens to organize and mobilize more effectively, we're seeing deep regression in the ability of citizens to participate fully in those systems, but amplified at the multilateral level by the fact that autocrats get the same vote and in some cases have a greater influence in the global system. So, and that many people feel completely detached for all those reasons you were talking about, what the natural reactions people have when we talk about the UN system. I suppose there are some who say, well, it's not the job of the UN to become sort of popular or publicly credible in some ways. And if you think that's a joke, I don't know if Amina said it this morning, but when during the post-2015 process, there was a survey called World We Want. Claire Melamed and others were deeply involved, and it involved asking in the end something like 5 million people what they thought should be in what's now the SDGs. And apparently 10 million people, I stand corrected, 10 million people, it was only 9 million yesterday. 10 million people, and apparently Amina, a diplomat from a member state came up to Amina and said, what right do you have to ask our people what they think? And yet, for most of us, the SDGs are very much, the people's goals. It's our collective vision of what a just, sustainable and fair world needs to be. And I'm not entirely sure that the system is anywhere near fit for that sort of purpose. But on the other hand, there are things that make me hopeful. The 1 for 7 billion campaign run so well a couple of years ago during the selection or election of this SG had garnered huge interest. Because people, certainly segments of populations deeply care about these institutions, deeply care about openness and transparency. And just at a time when that openness, transparency, and participation is sort of fast forwarding in many other institutions, I think it would be very dangerous for the UN system not to catch up. And if you look at the sort of nitty-gritty of how the current system works, it's piecemeal at best. You have a handful of people working in things like the NGO liaison service or in DPI whose responsibility is supposed to be to engage or do public outreach. We have an NGO accreditation system which is, it's not only not fit for purpose, but it's become deeply politicized and meaningless in some ways in terms of the credibility of organizations. And so, and of course, I know there's been lots of improvements in DPI in terms of the UN information centers and things like that, but that all feels like outdated propaganda system at a time when we need deep engagement. And what would it look like for the UN to have a dedicated agency for engagement? We might call it UN-Gage. Bring together some of these outreach opportunities, and instead of it being about disseminating and making the UN famous or making the SDGs famous, which is what lots of people spend their time doing, let's make these things useful to people in everyday life. Let's get, at least some people in the world excited about collective decision-making at the global level. That, may eventually lead to all sorts of other difficult questions about how you structure the Security Council or the UN infrastructure, but it's a necessary and good place to start, I think.
There would probably be unengage, which is what the UN has done for
yeah, that's a good point.
Patricia, a slightly different angle for you, as you're someone who works at the interface of policy and academia. We've been speaking a lot over the last 2 days about the many communities that loved Kofi Annan. And I think it's fair to say that one community that owed him a lot of love were academics, because his office reached out to academics very regularly, and people like Michael Doyle, John Ruggie, and of course Stephen Stedman, who spoke yesterday, and Andy Mack were leading academics who really sort of drove a lot of this policy thinking. I'm not sure that the UN has been as good at engaging with ideas since Kofi left. But I wonder, from your perspective, if you were to be a relatively young academic now, and I think we have some relatively young academics here, what would you be studying? What would you be researching that you think will be crucial to the UN over the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So I think if we look at the changing world, where academics are really engaging is in the changes going on obviously in our climate, and the implications that there are then for the way in which humans live, and particularly the impact that's likely to happen in terms of migration, in terms of agriculture leading to migration, in terms of conflict that could emerge from that. So part of the conflict prevention discourse has to be with academics about the likely impacts, and most importantly is how to prepare for them. So it's all about preparation, resilience, equaling prevention of the worst cases. I think that's really where we need to go. And there's an awful lot of work on that. And then I think the next big change, of course, is the technical change, and we've seen the beginnings of it. And we're all thinking, oh, there's been so much change, you know, the way in which we use computers, the way in which we use our smartphones, the way in which we're all connected. This is just the beginning. And so we need to suddenly ramp up our brains as to what's going to happen when we get the combination of really working artificial intelligence, machine decision making, with big data, with quantum computing capabilities. And I should say also quantum communication, which will change the way we communicate. So we have some huge changes on the way, enormous benefits in, for example, engagement. You know, we can really start to engage with people in a way at large scale. We can really start to understand the way humans behave, which will help us in conflict prevention. It will help us in resilience and mitigation. But there are big risks. So, you know, when we have, for example, you know, one of the things that I've just been talking about yesterday, which is why I couldn't come all day yesterday, was I was in a meeting talking about the vulnerabilities, the cyber vulnerabilities, if you like, of our strategic systems, of our command and control. Throughout most countries in the world that have weapons systems, this is the case. They're all reliant on a common set of technologies, on a common set of satellites in the sky, and there have been a number of attacks through that. Plus, the speed of decision making. You know, it's changed completely, and in the weapons situation, that's really true. So we already cannot make decisions without the use of AI. Not properly, not in the time that we have. So the question is, we essentially use machines to tell us what to decide. So we're still held responsible for the decision, but really, we're not truly responsible because we haven't got the brain speed to be able to do what they do. So we have to think about machines in a different way. And I think we have to, instead of trying to think like machines and trying to, you know, man versus machine, humans versus machine, I think we have to get machines to think and act like us a bit. And this is really difficult, isn't it? Because this takes us into a dystopia. But unless we can do that and program into human decision-making into our machines, they're always going to give us an answer, or they're often going to give us an answer that we wouldn't necessarily make. And then we're in trouble because we're held responsible. And they're big issues, but that's what's coming down the track quite quickly.
Well, I mean, algorithms can now write complex legal documents, and I've been wondering for a while whether actually most General Assembly resolutions could just be written by robots, much faster than human diplomats could produce them, and probably better. We now have just under half an hour for questions and answers. I'll take questions in blocks of 3. Please throw up your hand, and we'll start with another former British ambassador to the UN. Can we have... Thank you.
Jeremy Greenstock. geopolitical advisor to the corporate sector in my current situation. I need to say something I think quite controversial because it comes out of Kofi's legacy. Kofi understood that he had to deal beyond governments. And he's the only Secretary General that really moved things beyond governments, being the UN. And the controversial thing I think I need to say, against the background of what you've all been saying in the most interesting way, is that governments are becoming the enemies of the UN. And that the UN stands for something which governments are not enacting, because governments are all about control of power, and governments are losing control of power to the individual, to the civil society, to the private sector, to information, to AI. That reform is for the birds. It's not the issue. The issue is what the UN stands for and how global citizens can achieve what the UN stands for. And governments are not going to deliver that because they're on another agenda. And as their control of their own situation diminishes, they turn to their own societies to dominate or persuade them to keep them in power, and they forget about the UN. Why Kofi was so effective in speaking to the world from inside the UN was because he understood what the inside of the UN is like. And governments never come to the UN as permanent representatives do, and as UN Secretariat and agency participants do, practitioners do. They don't come inside the UN and understand the collegiality of the UN responsibility of individuals to do something for the world. And that is what we've got to look for, and you're not going to get it from governments. Now, when Patricia was talking, I began to imagine an AI General Assembly of machines. And perhaps machines have got to agree with each other as to what the right decision is. We've got to go somewhere else. Maybe there will be a new generation of government. Maybe this generation has got to move on. But the world's not stable enough for that for the moment, so it's probably not the way it's going to happen. But it's not about reform, it is about connecting with everybody out there who wants to be connected back. And Danny, you were beginning to get onto that in the way that you were thinking. How do we do that, and how do governments allow that to happen? Because if governments go on the way they're going to be in conflict with each other, over our heads, with the UN unable to do anything about it, because that is the history of the human race. And we've got to do something unprecedented to stop that happening again. And the UN is the thing that is different from previous eras, that has the norms, precepts, and will, in its systems and in the appeal it has for people to do that. And we've got to find a way of actually making that happen.
Thank you. Martin.
Martin Barber. I think Jeremy set me up, as my co-speaker yesterday set me up. Would the panel agree that the UN remains over-centralized and still top-down, and that what we've been listening to, but perhaps not hearing over the last day and a half, is that if the UN is to succeed, Kofi Annan's legacy is to be learned from, it must become a bottom-up, decentralized organization. And that if the aspiration of a graduate is to attend or be an intern in New York the year after they graduated, this is not the organization that it should be. We should be looking at an organization that starts thinking at the national level, that sends that thinking to the regions. What are all these regional commissions doing? and sends that thinking to the regional commissions, and then from there, only then do these ideas get thought about in New York. So my own sense would be, why not say, look, we want to send the agenda setting exercise right back down to the place where people live, and then look at it from that perspective rather than from the old top-down perspective.
The lady at the back centre. I see.
Hi, Mathoni Wanyeki, Africa Director with OSF. Just two questions, and I'm sort of curious about hearing everyone's views on them. One is, quite a bit has been said yesterday about the improvement in relationships between the AU and the UN, including the Memorandum of Understanding, the idea of joint analysis from the bottom up, and so on. Two questions when it comes to reform. As we know, one of the key, very old demands from the Africa Group has been around Security Council reform. Where are we on that, if anywhere at all? And the second is a newer demand when it comes to the African Peacebuilding Fund, African Peace Fund, the idea of sharing assessed contributions to the UN in terms of responsibility sharing for peacekeeping that's increasingly happening. And I'm curious about hearing what the views are internally within the UN on that, but also from, say, the UK, a member state sitting here. And then the second question is, many of you have spoken throughout here on this panel, but also yesterday, about the opening up of the UN to civil society, the multi-stakeholder approach, and I think that was replicated during his time within the regional commissions. It's absolutely absent now. And it was never really hit sort of the country office coordination effort. And again, I'm curious to hear about what the plans are there. Certainly on the ground, I think the sentiment is the country offices, country teams really work at the behest of, in the service of, in the pocket of member states, certainly not for civil society on the ground or any other audience other than themselves. Thank
you. I think as time is against us, I'm just going to take a whole bundle of questions, and the speakers can then respond to those that they wish. The gentleman here.
Ronan Tynan, I was Martin's co-speaker, as he eloquently put it yesterday, and I too would agree with what Jeremy said when he made the very fundamental point. It's not about reform. I put it to the panel, it's about what the UN stands for, and I particularly addressed that point to Danny, because during the reign of Kofi Annan, we knew what the UN was about. We understood what the UN stood for, and it stood fundamentally for respect for human rights, civil and political, economic, social and cultural, with all the constraints that apply. But today, we're in I would regard as a crisis situation, and we need to confront it. Example, and only one example. At the moment, humanitarians will not give the coordinates of hospitals in Idlib to the UN because the UN passed them on to Russia. Russia bombed the hospitals. And what happened? The UN humanitarian chief, when pressed many times, refused even then, when he had every moral authority to do it, despite the geopolitical considerations, refused to condemn that. At the same time, by leading human rights defenders, Kofi Annan Antonio Guterres is criticized for his silence on human rights issues. This is fundamental. This is the real crisis. Unless the UN stands for something, and more so than ever, it must be human rights. Because that very eloquent quote, remember, I can't remember the full one, but it's from Kofi Annan. Do you remember what he said about globalization? Unless we confronted the injustice of globalization, all the isms of the 20th century would revisit us. They are revisiting us now. Thank you.
Okay, there were a bunch of questions over here. We'll start with Steve Stedman and move this way. Do remember, questions are like children. They're best when they're short. Steve.
So I want to share a joke that I shared with the SG during my time at the UN. I would often sit in meetings about UN reform, and there was a cartoon in the New Yorker that came out that showed two drunks at a bar, and they were both toasting each other, and the caption underneath was, "Here's to missing the big picture." And the SG really liked that cartoon. It was a classic. So here's what I think has been missing the last 2 days. When I first heard about this conference, about Kofi's legacy, immediately for me, I actually had the answer. For me, is that Kofi Annan made the United Nations relevant, and he did it twice at a time when people actually thought the UN was completely irrelevant. When it had failed in Rwanda and it had failed in Srebrenica, and people thought peacekeeping was dead. And then in 2003, as David mentioned, after the United States went to war without a Security Council resolution, and there were actually, fears, well-founded, that the United States was simply going to walk away from the organization. And I feel like that's really the challenge, and we've been dancing around it in different ways. In an era of virulent nationalism and protectionism, where I wouldn't want to put anything into a UN process where you have the likes of Bolsonaro and Trump and whoever you're going to produce in the next month or so, making decisions about UN processes, structures, architecture. Come on. It's like, forget the reform and talk about what is it that's going to make the UN relevant right now. And some of the answers are a strong voice in human rights, taking leadership on climate when some of the biggest states are turning their backs on it. Maybe, again, reinvigorating the whole debate around disarmament, because Lord knows where we're headed on that. But I think that's really the challenge. How could the SG and how does the UN make the UN relevant today?
Fred.
Fred Carver, UNA. I was just wondering if the panel would say that there are certain things the UN does that maybe actually other institutions, partners and stakeholders might actually do better. If they do, could you maybe just list one thing that maybe the UN should stop doing?
Yes, please, and then Hans, one second.
Thank you. Francesca Grandi from International Institute for Strategic Studies. My question is about prevention, because many of the things that were said about it, I fully agree with. So I think one of the ways to go is certainly to expand the concepts into including a broader idea of crisis prevention that looks at climate change and migration and other very important factors. But what is a little bit puzzling to me is that having worked at the UN at the time in which prevention was very much at the center of the agenda, so that was 2004 through 2006 and 2008, I wonder what has changed now that might make the issue more politically appealing, where the weaknesses of having the political buy-in of a prevention agenda are still very much there, because it's an issue that is it's very difficult to convince that it works, because the evidence is particularly tricky. And at the same time, it's true that very often media attention and government's attention just goes directly to what is seen as an emergency. Thank you.
And straight to Hans Corral.
Thank you. Hans Corral, former legal counsel of the UN again. This is just a point of information. Listening to the first panel today and listening to you, there is a legacy from Kofi Annan that I think is so important. His understanding about the importance of the rule of law. And in the morning when they discussed the Sustainable Development Goals, which contains one goal, 16, I belong to those who believe that goal 16, equal justice for all, with its targets, rule of law and anti-corruption, is necessary to achieving all the other goals. And when I listen to you now, I realize also the responsibility of politicians. Here you have the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. In Sweden, we have a center called Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. It's named for Raoul Wallenberg, who was the uncle of Nan Annan, who is with us here. Raoul Wallenberg was the brother of Nan's mother. This institute and the sister institute in the Netherlands has produced something that I would like you to take down 7 words soon. It is a guide for politicians on the rule of law. It's the Hague Institute for Internationalization of Law. So this guide, Rule of Law, a guide for politicians, please take down those words. You'll find it immediately. It is available. It's some 40 pages, doesn't cost anything. It's available in 25 languages on the web, and there will be 1 additional language in a few days, namely Hindi. Rule of Law, a guide for politicians. Thank you.
If you could pass it straight across the aisle. I have recognized 2 more. Oh, and I recognize 7 more questions over here. Well, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. This question for Danny, actually. If all the policies will be implemented by machines, probably, if we're talking of AI, what is, and if the people programming AI are whiz kids who are interested in how quickly it's going to happen rather than the ethics and the politics that we are talking about, what is the UN's role in influencing what they put in the machines?
Sir, dead center.
Thank you. I thought you were going to ask Danny whether his internship was paid or not. And that's why you're the CEO of one of the greatest NGOs in the world. I'm puzzled. I've been involved in public information and communication at the United Nations for 2 decades. And all I'm hearing here for 2 days is that the United Nations is having difficulty communicating its message. Michel, you said, and I quote, "How do we convince people that we have a global order that can solve their problems?" Amina Mohammed said the same thing, more or less yesterday. We have a problem communicating our message. Our voice is not heard. What's the problem? Why isn't there? There's a huge department that Danny referred to as the Department of Public Information, which I believe now is the Department of Global Communication. What's going on? Is there a strategy to meet the challenges of the 21st century? There's a UN panel on digital cooperation that you told us about, and somebody else did earlier, launching its report next Monday. Do we not have a public information and communication strategy to, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And the lady, yes, just there.
Elizabeth Mortimer. The United Nations is the overarching international institution, which is the only hope for people worried about climate change. They've provided the information. All around, young people are fighting and struggling to get their voices heard, to ask people to do something. If the United Nations made some sort of action on the thing instead of actually producing statistics and warnings, perhaps they would gain the attention and the loyalty of the young people and others who fear the future. So I have a suggestion which I think Kofi might have liked because he was a practical man. I think, what about the United Nations or Secretary General proposing a rainforest forum in which the value of the rainforests to the whole world was roughly calculated, and then the people who now cut them down to grow fairly cheap and worthless crops were compensated by money and support to keep them alive and keep them growing. This would be a simple, practical, and very public act of something to prevent climate change and to stop what's going on, which is so disastrous for the planet. So why doesn't the United Nations do that?
Thank you. I know we have more questions. I'm really sorry, but the next panel is looming in front of me. So we will now ask the panelists to respond to whichever of those questions they wish to, and we'll go in reverse order. So, Patricia.
Thanks a lot. So I would say the most important thing for the UN to grasp the narrative is to go back to its core purpose. I'm always intrigued that we keep on forgetting that the core purpose of the UN is to prevent conflict, to prevent war. And that's why I think the Secretary General's new agenda is so important. But if we can remember that, and that's why everything else happens around it, that its real core purpose is that. And then I think the Charter, which, you know, is a beautiful document, recognizes the role of the UN in managing and brokering power by state, it's power of the state, if you like. Now, part of the problem is that, you know, that states are always trying to find ways to get around that, but that is the beauty of the UN Charter. So if we could include in the rule of law, including the UN Charter, I think that's right. And in terms of prevention and the issue of evidence, I think we have a lot of evidence for prevention. But we need to now gather it and make a strong case. There's a new book out called Measuring Peace. We've got a lot of indicators for the SDGs, which are at the heart, you know, at the heart are human rights steps and are very much vital for conflict prevention. So I think we've got the building blocks in place now to demonstrate the effectiveness of conflict prevention. So I think that will start to take shape in the way that we now understand how to prevent disease, how to prevent ill health. We'll start to understand it and put it together much better in the coming decades. And then, to me, you know, I think the questions that we keep on coming back to is the UN role in influencing and not hearing the voice. And for me, it's about seizing the narrative. It's not the message, it's not sending out. It is listening, getting back, but it's also about creating the narrative about what is right in the world, what we really all know in our guts that some people try to circumvent for their own personal gain. There's very few of them, but they do a lot of damage. So the vast majority of us really get this. So we've just got to, I think, find a way in which that conversation can be had and squash down the few who try to disrupt it all the time.
Thank you. Danny. And also, Patricia mentioned her bugbear in reform. Please also mention the reform proposal you like least. But do answer the question,
Okay.
Steve, first.
Well, maybe I'll answer it in answering this "what should the UN stop doing" question, which is that, you know, we've seen in the last couple of decades continued proliferation of agencies and programs. Last time I checked, there were 250 odd UN or multilateral agencies and programs involved in the development industrial complex. And in an era when, you know, value for money is so critical, when institutions are being disintermediated left, right, and centre, we cannot afford to have this number of small agencies and programs, and we need some degree of consolidation. And I think Kofi Annan's era began that process, and as I'm sure Amina told you, you know, it's been the bane of her last few years as well. And I think we have no choice but to continue to do that. On Martin's and Jeremy's question, I think there is a, you know, if you take the question of digital cooperation, please do look out for the SG launching our report. I think it's 10 o'clock New York time on Monday morning. 10:45, thank you. You know, here is a set of global challenges that go to the heart of the value and legitimacy of the UN system. And I can't think of an alternative approach to how we as humanity are going to manage the challenges and opportunities of the digital era. I'm afraid, despite the bravado of many in the tech sector, we cannot leave it to tech companies to determine our common digital future. And yet, in some ways, that's the way we're going, because governments don't have the ability to control the flows, the instant, amazingly complex flows that are going on in every nanosecond, that, you know, in terms of shaping our digital lives. Governments, we know, can't control it. Tech pioneers, despite the fact that they've been driving this amazing ingenuity, cannot either. And if you want a stark reminder of why they cannot, a recent survey showed that 2/3 of Silicon Valley CEOs had never even heard of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. That this is a framework that is foreign to them, and they think they are out there doing no evil. And so, if it can't be governments alone, if it shouldn't be corporates and other influential, you know, the people who own much of our digital infrastructure, then it has to be a multilateral-led solution that probably, though, looks very different. And this is the point I wanted to make about decentralization. Much of the joy of the fantastic things that drive a device like this are deeply unfamiliar to us when it comes to governance. If you think of ICANN and how domain names are run, that the systems of governance that allow us to communicate in the amazing ways they do have evolved in some ways, though, through a level of cooperation that has been outside traditional structures and look far more interestingly decentralized than I think we've even started to contemplate when it comes to multilateralism. And I think that is the decentralized but cooperative future that we need to be thinking about when it comes to, for example, digital governance, but presumably a whole range of other areas of governance. Thank you. Michelle.
Okay, very quickly. The what does the UN stand for question, we heard so many different answers to that question, even just in this panel, never mind over the couple of days, and I do think that that's at the heart of the issue, right? For many people, and certainly for the drafters of the Charter, yes, preventing not just any old conflict, but great power conflict, right? That was what it was originally set up to do, and by the way, I think that's a very relevant function today. So, we can't lose sight of that original purpose. But of course, over 75 years, it has acquired many, many other purposes, some of which many of us hold equally important and dear. And the whole kind of balance between standing for the world as it is and operating as a kind of an actor on the geopolitical power stage and trying to shape the way the way governments behave is increasingly difficult to balance with standing the kind of moral voice, the standing for the world as it should be, pushing norms and standing for norms and principles. And I think, the SG, it's always, that balance has always been there. Dag Hammarskjöld spoke very eloquently about how the UN kind of essentially is caught between those two poles. But I think in this geopolitial environment, Nader said it yesterday, we cannot overstate the difficulty of this environment and of trying to stand for those two hugely important purposes at this very difficult time. And I think, Steve, on your questions, you listed 3 things that the SG is actually doing a lot of, being criticized for, but the 3 things you listed he is doing. He is leading on climate change. He is reinvigorating the disarmament agenda. He has a whole new agenda on that. I know he's been criticized on human rights, but he is in fact doing a huge amount on human rights. And so the fact that that's not being heard, and to your point, Ahmed, also, we are against these enormous headwinds. It is a very difficult time. It is a time in which the friends of the UN are not speaking up, and I think that is your answer. These things are happening, but they're not getting the same traction and resonating in the same way, and that has a lot, of course, to do with the changing landscape of actors and the UN trying to find its voice in that new environment. And then on the conflict, the prevention question, what has changed? I think one huge change for the prevention agenda is the existence of the SDGs. Developing countries have now agreed that peace and justice and also all of these things that didn't used to be part of the traditional kind of definition of what development meant are absolutely core. And that has actually changed a lot for us in kind of our daily business. And it's to the question also about UN country teams on the ground. It's changed the job description of a lot of UN people. And we're still grappling with what that really means in practice and whether, of course, it's doable. What does it mean to be kind of using our entire set of development tools in a much more overtly preventive way in, again, a world where, in fact, the conflicts are metastasizing before our eyes, spiraling out of control. Even the big powers can't control them anymore. They now involve a toxic mix of criminality and jihadism and poverty and discrimination, and so they're becoming more complex, just as we, I think, are actually acquiring more tools and more permission to address them across the gamut. And finally, the bugbear question. For me, it's not one specific reform bugbear. It's a pattern of, I think, if you look at every major reform effort, certainly with which I'm familiar, and going some way back before then, there's one pattern that I think we absolutely need to address, or we just should stop reforming. And that is the pattern whereby we continually try to make institutional fixes to what are fundamentally political problems. And that is the source of the proliferation you spoke about, Danny. Every single reform effort leaves, as David said, on the cutting room floor some of its most important ideas. And I think if you look back at the Brahimi report, at the 2003 effort, 97, the most recent sets of reforms, the things that get left on the cutting room floor are very often actually the things that were presented as prerequisites for the rest of the ideas in the package. They're usually about how member states govern and mandate us and about funding. And pretty much every reform effort you'll see, those ideas either get watered down or die, and the institutional ideas come to the fore. So every single reform effort I've been involved in, all of the energy and attention ends up on moving the deck chairs in the UN, creating new structures, creating new agencies, rarely abolishing any, but very, very little attention gets paid to the big questions of how the UN is governed, mandated, and funded. And until we fix those problems, I think, you know, one wonders whether it's worth it to even keep trying.
David, lift our mood.
Well, I'm not sure that's what I will do, because some of my responses will not be particularly positive. I do think that we must get away from the idea that we're talking about a great battle royal between world government on the one hand, good thing, and nation states on the other hand, bad thing. If we ever get into that, which is, of course, the tune to which people like John Bolton like to sing, we are lost. It is an organization of nation states, and we've got to get back, I would suggest, to the concept that led it to be founded, which is that nation states operating in an untrammeled, undisciplined, and completely erratic way have a capacity to kill a rather large number of each other in the process, a capacity which in the last 70 years has been increased by the existence of nuclear weapons. So we need to get back to that. The UN is there to save nation states from themselves, not to abolish them. Now, if I could just move on from that to top-down, bottom-up. I wish I believed it could be done, but there's 1.3 billion reasons why it can't be done. The population of China, for example. You can't have a bottom-up approach to the UN issues with an authoritarian regime in Beijing which tells people what they're going to say. And there's nothing we can do to stop that regime continuing to be that regime. I haven't even heard Donald Trump arguing for regime change in Beijing. He doesn't normally stint in such matters. So I'm sorry, I just don't think it is doable, desirable, though it may very well be. The question of Secretaries Generals using the bully pulpit. I'm a strong, strong believer in the fact that that is one of the functions of the Secretary General. Of the only two, Hammarskjöld and Kofi, I think, have really used that to the maximum, I fear the present incumbent so far has not made as good use of it as he might have done, though I thought myself that he might do, because I've heard him speaking in public and he can speak extremely eloquently, and I wish he would now do a bit more of that, because, and that leads me on to Ahmed's question about communications. This is not a problem just of the UN. If you look at the European Union, you will see exactly the same problem. That is that the central organization, the Commission in the EU case, the Secretariat in the UN's case, cannot be the sole purveyor of communications about the organization with the 192 or 28 members just standing back saying, they're getting it all wrong. So if you cannot get the member states to join in the selling, as it were, the narrative of why we need the UN, you are not going to succeed in a communications policy. It cannot be done centrally. Now, I think we were asked, yes, what should the UN stop doing? Well, I'm sorry to be so extremely conventional, but I have never quite seen what on earth UNCTAD does that is very useful for anyone. And I don't say that in order to be rude about UNCTAD. I say it because I think the UN is neglecting to realize the extraordinary dangers we are now in with the dismantling of the World Trade Organization's rules by the US administration. That ought to bring home to us, but I'm not sure it has brought home to those in the UN family who've always tended to regard the WTO as something that happens a long way away in another city and not much to do with them. I think they are ignoring that at their peril now. It is not UNCTAD that is going to save the WTO. It is the member states of the WTO who are going to save it, if necessary, leaving the Trump administration on one side for a certain amount of time, if we can find ways of circumventing his attempts to dismantle the dispute settlement procedure. I think that is absolutely vital, and I think the UN should make that part of its approach to these matters every bit as much as the things that it is more directly involved in. I do agree with Hans Corell about the rule of law. I think that the importance of the rule of law in helping countries get back on their feet when they've been destroyed either by intrastate conflict or interstate conflict is often underestimated. I think the balance between democratic elections and the rule of law tends to be got wrong. And I think the rule of law needs to have greater prominence, not at the expense of democratic elections, but as an essential part of that. It's no good having the democratic elections if there's absolutely no rule of law. So I entirely agree with that. And with that, I'm sorry to be a little bit negative, but I do myself think that the UN is here to stay. I have never had the slightest doubt about that. The resilience of this organization is a lot greater than people think it is. And it's interesting that if you get an issue that really catches people's imagination, like climate change, what, if you ask most people, would they say? They'd say, we want the UN to do something about it, because they do understand that individual countries cannot deal with climate change. So there you have a really benevolent junction of subject matter and people's interest. It won't always be so. There will be some things the UN does which are pretty esoteric and which people don't understand terribly well, and probably the greatest efforts of all the best communicators, and several of them are in this room, including Edward Mortimer, I may say, who did an enormous amount to help Kofi use the bully pulpit, and Stephen Stedman, who did an enormous amount to put fuel in the tank of the reform efforts of 2003 to 2005. I just do think that there are some things that you probably can't get people very excited about, but there are the things you need to identify them, which you can.
Thank you. We have to stop now. David has to go and give a speech to the Lords on D-Day. Are you for it or against it? Sorry.
I'm respectful.
Thank you very much. I know we haven't answered all your questions. I think I will answer the one question of the lady who asks, is there any progress on Security Council reform? We can answer that in 3 words. They are ha, ha, ha. No. Thank you to a great panel, and please stay in your seats and we'll turn straight over to the next.